Hello and welcome to the last Lunch and Learn of 2021. I can't believe we're fast approaching the end of another interesting year. My name is Gisela Lopez and I am the Executive Director of the YJI. Let me take a moment to thank our funders and partners at the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group, at the CJS, OCFS, and at the University at Albany for their support for this series. It is my absolute pleasure to have Professor Benjamin Van Rooij with us today. If you haven't had a chance to read his book, The Behavioral Code, please consider doing so. I'm going to ask the YJI team to put a link to it in the chat right now. I found it to be compelling, very well written, and extremely stimulating intellectually. May make for a good Christmas or holiday gift. Today, we're switching things up, and I'm pleased to have Tani Cruz moderate the conversation with Professor Van Rooij. Brian Rainey will be returning in the new year. Tani is one of our brilliant research assistants here at the Institute. Please join me in welcoming her into this new co-hosting role at the Lunch and Learn. Tani, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. As Giza mentioned, my name is Tani Cruz, and I'm a graduate research assistant here at the YJI. As a reminder, the goals of this webinar series are to act as a source for cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues, to provide information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and finally, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore these issues. I'm excited to announce today's presenter, Dr. Benjamin Van Rooij. Van Rooij is Faculty Director of Research and Professor of Law and Society at the Faculty of Law, University of Amsterdam. He is also a Global Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine. He studies and teaches about the interaction between law and behavior. His current research focuses on individual differences in compliance, toxic corporate culture, and assumptions about behavioral change. His past work looked at compliance, regulatory law enforcement, and access to justice in China in a comparative perspective. He is also co-editor of Regulation and Governance and founding convener of ComplianceNet, a global network of compliance scholars. His work has been published in leading academic journals, as well as popular outlets such as the New York Times, the LA Times, The Hill, NPR, and the Huffington Post. His latest book is The Behavioral Code, The Hidden Ways the Law Makes Us Better or Worse. And without further ado, I introduce Dr. Benjamin Van Rooij.
Thank you so much. And I want to first of all, thank you really so much for having me here today. It's really exciting for me to come speak to the practitioners and experts on youth justice. I really want to thank all the organizers of the New York Youth Justice Institute for doing such a fabulous job in organizing this talk. All right, let me share my screen. Let me see. Let me share my screen. Here it is. Okay. So together with Adam Fine, who is a professor of criminology and criminal justice, and also has a PhD in developmental psychology and was a former speaker here. I've written a book called The Behavioral Code. And in this book, we focus on understanding how law shapes human behavior. And this book came about because the predominant view on law and behavior in the legal world, but I think also often as we see it portrayed in the media and maybe even in practice, is that law sort of plays a role once we've had bad behavior, sort of ex post, and then lawyers figure out what the right rules are to assign liabilities to people who may have caused damages to others. We really believe that law has another function to play, which is much more ex ante, much more preventative. And law can shape human behavior. We think and we argue that law is the biggest, most important human-made system to shape human conduct. And the interesting thing is that the people that make laws, the people that operate laws, largely don't have a background in behavioral science. At the same time, we see that there's a large amount of data a large amount of analysis and also conclusions with implications for how law can become more effective in shaping human behavior in a way that's also more fair and just and less costly. So we try to map this. So in the whole book, we try to have a scientific basis. It is a popular science book, meaning that it's accessible and written as much as possible in a fun way. At the same point, we really try and cover the science in a way that's nuanced and that's honest, and that's not just trying to sell a sort of quick fix that isn't there. What we do in the book is that we show the different ways in which law comes to shape behavior, and we guide readers through this complexity. What we also try and do is to show people what the science says, and at points this is counterintuitive. And this also asks the readers, and probably the audience today, to sort of press pause on their first reactions, because sometimes what science finds is not what we assume it to be. So this is sort of the background. What I'll do today is walk you through some of the core insights in the book. So let's start with punishment. One of the core things when we think about how law shapes behavior, one of the first things most people think about is, well, people behave better when they fear punishment. So let's look at this study. There was a study done in Israeli daycare centers who had a problem. Parents were coming too late to pick up their kids. Anybody who has kids that have gone to daycare centers, like I have, understands this sort of case where you're too late. It's already past closing time, and these poor teachers in the daycare center have to wait for you as a parent coming late. So they did an experiment. They instituted fines in half of the daycare centers in their sample. The other half, they just kept the original arrangements where there were no fines. And you see what happened here. You see the amount of late arrivals, which you see on the y-axis. And you see as the number of weeks, you see that the group with the fine is compared with the control group. And what you see is they instituted the fine by week 5. So the real experimental difference starts at week 5. And then we see that, quite surprisingly, at least to me, that until week 17, when they ended the fine, that parents that were fined were coming later than the parents who weren't fined. And the analysis of this study was, well, it changed sort of the understanding of what coming late was. Before, coming late was something you shouldn't do. And there was an intrinsic motivation people had for not coming late because you felt bad, maybe not only for your kids, but especially for the staff at the daycare center. When the fine was instituted, this fine sort of became a payment for coming late. But what is extra interesting is what happened after week 17, when the fine was ended, and actually the situation between the two groups of daycare centers should be the same again. But we see after that time that there was still a significant difference between the two. So it seemed that the fine, when it was instituted, actually had a long-term effect even after the fine was lifted. What this shows is that punishment in this form of a fine for not really criminal behavior, but for behavior that is considered to be damaging, at least to the daycare centers, can actually backfire. What all this shows is that if we're talking about punishment and instituting punishment to shape behavior, we always have to ask the question, what can we expect the punishment to do in terms of shaping the behavior? If I look at sort of the evidence that we've looked at that's more related to crime, first of all, we see that stricter punishment in of itself does not reduce crime through deterrence. So we see that studies of capital punishment, studies of sentence enhancement, like the 3 strikes you're out policies, they all show the same thing, that there's no conclusive evidence that stricter punishment reduces crime. That also that doesn't mean that there is evidence that it doesn't work, that there simply isn't evidence that it works. That's a very important point. There is even some evidence that it may make things worse. And in this group, you may have heard of this. So the criminogenic effect of incarceration, where a sort of prisons serve as universities for crime. You also see that there can be brutalizing effects, where people become more violent when the punishment becomes stronger, which we see with the 3rd strike. Which we also see with offenses facing capital punishment. The other big insight for which we do have evidence is that certainty of punishment is more important than the severity of punishment, Actually, punishment only starts to work when there's a threshold level of certainty. And in the past, when criminologists were still focused on this question, they've calculated what these threshold levels are. And I don't recall the exact numbers, they're in the book. But let's say, for instance, for a crime like burglary, if you don't have a 20% chance of being caught and punished, the higher level of punishment won't have any effect, or any punishment won't have any effect. This means that as an implication, you should invest more in the ability of police to investigate, or the ability of regulatory authorities, when you're talking about other types of violations of law, to investigate, rather than focusing on investing in the cost of punishment, for instance, in building more jails or prisons. The third big point we see is that the perceptions of punishment, so the perceptions of the strictness of punishment and severity and certainty of punishment, are not the same as the punishment reality. And this can be really positive. For instance, in the Netherlands, the Dutch tax authorities, most Dutch citizens believe that the chance of being caught and punished for evading individual income tax reporting is, people overestimate the chance of being caught and punished, and they also overestimate the punishment that they will get, which is a really good thing. It means that you don't need to do that much, but the people still have a sort of deterrent perception. But what we see happens a lot more often, especially with street crime or general crime, is that people underestimate the chances of being caught, and also underestimate the severity of the punishment. And this means that that law enforcement has a problem, because all the work that they're doing is not arriving at the people whose decisions they're trying to influence. And it also means that if they want to get better leverage out of punishment, which is, I think, the core thing, you want to do as little law enforcement as possible to have the largest effect on a larger group, on a larger population. That means that you need to communicate. And when I talk with people in practice about this, I find that this is not something that's really part of the core policy. One study, for instance, about environmental violations by corporations found that even these really highly specialized corporations in chemical industry who have environmental managers, they don't even know exactly what the core cases are that the EPA has been punishing, about which the EPA has also made a public messaging campaign targeting these people. Finally, what we see is, and this is sort of the most recent research, holistic sort of approaches. These are called focused deterrence, that combine sort of a swift and severe punishment with other interventions, and I'll get to the others, that, for instance, provide support, training, housing, education, and other things do work. So it shows that when you look at all of this, that in of itself, stricter punishment is not going to be enough, and we need to look further. Second, we need to make sure that there's a certainty if we rely on punishment. And third, that people actually get the right communication about this. If I make this a little bit more complex, and I won't go into everything that's here, but if you read the full book, you'll find that there's at least 17 potential effects of punishment. And it depends on the punishment, the type of crime, the type of persons involved, the type of context, the broader context that this then occurs in, what you will get. So punishment can have several positive effects in theory. So first of all, it can set a norm. If we don't punish, we'll get impunity. It might have deterrence, both for the people who have been punished, specific deterrence, as well as for others. But as I just said, the evidence for that happening is rather limited. It can reassure people who are following rules. If you don't see anybody else punished, you might at some point think, why am I not doing X? It might incapacitate. So while people are in prison, they might not reoffend. But the evidence for that is also quite weak. I can go into that if you want during Q&A. But on the negative side, it can also have a lot of effects. And the first one I already discussed when discussing the Israeli daycare centers. There were positive social norms, but by instituting a punishment, you may erode them. I'll talk about some of these other behaviors later. I already mentioned criminogenic effects. These brutalizing effects. But you might also, if you punish more, make people incentivize that people will evade detection more. And finally, it can undermine procedural justice. So unfair or overly strict law enforcement can undermine people's perceptions of the fairness of the system, and therefore also make them comply less. And I believe Adam Fine has discussed this issue when he was here before. Our book also has a whole chapter about this. So that's sort of the first thing I wanted to discuss today, which is, okay, this thing, punishment, which a lot of people see as the core way in which law shapes behavior. And what we see is sort of a mixed way in which it does so. The core lesson that we draw out from this in the book is, look, the whole influence on human conduct is not just through punishment or even through extrinsic motivation. We also need to really look at intrinsic motivation. And let me start with an example again. So in Arizona, the Petrified Forest, which is a national park, which has these beautiful fossil stones of fossilized wood. They're really colorful. You can look them up online. But the park had a problem that a lot of people were stealing these fossils as sort of a souvenir to take home. So they teamed up with social scientists, with Bob Cialdini from Arizona State University, to sort of see what they could do. And they did a bunch of experiments, and I want to talk about one. So if you read this sign on the left, it says, please don't remove the petrified wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state of the petrified forest. Okay, so if you think about what is this sign trying to do, this sign is trying to persuade people not to steal because it would hurt the park. And that makes sense. I mean, stealing is illegal, so the law is there already, but they're trying to kind of bolster the law with a sort of moral appeal. Preserve the natural state of the petrified forest. Then the other one, it makes a similar appeal, but they only changed the first part of the sentence. Many past visitors have moved petrified wood from the park, changing the natural state of the petrified forest. And what the scientists found was that this second sign actually increased theft compared to the baseline, whereas the sign on the left, it decreased theft. And what they argue and what they found, because they did a lot of studies on this, is actually that the first part of the sentence is the problem. It says many past visitors have removed petrified wood. And what they were doing with this sign, and you can imagine there are many signs like this, is to show that it actually is quite normal to do this. So what was at play here? There was a negative social norm. It was normal for people to steal the wood, and that negative norm was activated by the sign. And this can happen quite easily in different situations. So what we learned from this, and there's many other lessons on intrinsic motivation in the book, but I only picked one. We learned from this that social norms play a vital role in shaping our human conduct. On the one hand, we have the problem, like we saw with the Israeli daycare centers, that law and law enforcement can undermine positive social norms and therefore create less compliance. At the same point, law enforcement or messaging about the law can also activate negative social norms. So imagine, for instance, what we've had in the Netherlands, where we've had a lot of violation of COVID rules, where our Justice Department at some point said, look, so many people are violating the COVID rules and we already fined 10,000 people. What they were trying to do is send two messages. One is a deterrent message. I mean, this is what they wanted to do, is to deter people from doing it. But without knowing, they also sent this other message, which is, it's very normal to do this. And that's the problem. When you don't really know the social embedding of the behavior, then you may very well send this sort of a negative message without knowing so. So core thing is that you need to understand what the social norms are in order to activate them. Another part that we discuss in the book is the idea that legitimacy is a key for rule compliance. People obey rules not only because they fear punishment, not only because they think others do so, not only because they agree with the rules, they also do so because it is the law. I mean, we've all seen these signs where it says, don't do X, it's the law. And the fact that people obey rules because it's the law is one of the strongest things that our legal system can have, because there's always going to be rules that people don't like, for which there's limited law enforcement, and that others might violate as well. At some point, we have to go back to this sort of basic idea that we comply with the rules because we feel a sort of civil obedience. It's the opposite of civil disobedience. And in order to have that, the law itself needs to be operating procedurally fair in terms of how the rules are made and enforced. And the problem, of course, is that law enforcement at times has not been operating in a procedurally fair way. So there's a win-win situation here where you can have police reform as well as less crime. And I think, and the evidence is really clear here. The evidence is clear that procedural fairness does really predict lower levels of offending behavior. Of course, there's many complex issues here. Once people have a negative view of the procedural fairness of the system, it's very hard to change it. And of course, police reform in of itself is very difficult. And I'm happy to talk more about that during Q&A. So in all of this, we see that any intervention in crime should take account of the social context and also the legitimacy of the system. All right, let's move to the next sort of lesson. We're looking here at Maria Sharapova. Maria Sharapova is I think by now former Russian a tennis star. And this is her in the Hilton Hotel in LA a couple of years ago, where she had just admitted to having used a banned substance, a performance-enhancing substance called Meldonium. And as she was explaining to the press, she had been using this substance for several years because she had an affliction for which she needed it. But it was banned a month before, and she didn't know about the ban. And here's the interesting question. Of course, not knowing the law is not an excuse to break it, but can we expect people to follow rules that they don't know? This brings us to this sort of next core insight. People are more likely to comply with the law if they're able to follow the law. Practically able, cognitively able, personally able, and for organizations also organizationally able. And this is something we often forget. People may be breaking rules not because they're not motivated to comply with them, but because they're in a situation where complying is much harder. The first bombshell here is that most people don't know the law. We've gone through all the evidence. Most lay people don't know basic facts of criminal law. Adam has also looked at studies, for instance, by Beth Kaufman, who found that mothers of children who are in contact with who have been in contact with the criminal justice system don't know the very basic aspects of criminal justice and also criminal procedure. Employees don't know their basic employment law rights, and they overestimate the protection they have under law, which is really negative. We know that families don't understand family law and really basic things that relate to divorce, as well as children and custody and things like that. We also know that experts don't know the law. And this is the interesting thing. We know that doctors don't really understand really basic conceptions of their own liabilities, as well as doctor-patient privilege. We also know, for instance, that school principals don't know laws that pertain to education. So this is a major bombshell, because the way we in law, and I'm a lawyer by training, think about law as it's this sort of programming language in which if we write the rules in a certain way, it'll somehow get to the people whose behavior we want to change. And they will then understand these rules, and then they will then change their behavior depending on the incentives and the way that the law is implemented. And that's really not the model how the law works. Most people don't know most of the law. And from an ex post point of view, once something goes wrong, that's fine. I mean, we'll get a bunch of lawyers, if we can afford them, and they'll find out the applicable rules to this sort of behavior. But from an ex ante point of view, where law wants to shape behavior, the fact that people don't know the law is a major problem. There's several other issues we can discuss here. So let me give two other examples here. One is that people may personally be less able to follow rules. Here, a major insight from criminology and also psychology is that people who have lower self-control, and there's many ways to study this and define this, are more likely to be engaged in deviant and also rule-violating behavior. And of course, for youth, we know this is really relevant because people, as their brains are developing in adolescence and early adulthood, they have lower self-control and they're much more at risk of engaging in deviance. At the same time, we also know, and this is probably well known in this audience, that at some point, once the brain is mature, this level of self-control goes up. And also as they bond more socially, as well as other variables, they're going to be much less likely to engage in deviant or violent behavior. So that's at the personal level. And there's a lot we can do there. There's a lot of therapies that actually work very well. And the evidence here is really, really strong. I was personally quite surprised by the level of evidence on how interventions on sort of personal cognitive issues actually works quite well. We can also look more at the macro level. We see there's a very strong association between people's socioeconomic opportunities and crime. The poorer people are, the more likely that such people might engage in crime. The less education they have, the more likely that there is crime. And the stats here are really staggering. For every extra year on average that you get people to do in schooling, you're going to see a drop in homicide rates in terms of, I think it was between 15 and even 30%, but I would have to look that up. So what we see here is a very different view on law and behavior. It's not one where we're trying to persuade through punishment, maybe. It's not one where we're trying to get people to socially be connected or be or have this sense of duty. No, here it's all about support. Here it's all about education and treatment. Of course, the downside here is it's very easy to see all of this as soft on crime. What we argue is, we argue there is no soft or tough on crime. There's only smart and dumb on crime. And we really believe that being smart on crime requires the evidence of what works. And there's quite strong evidence here that all of this really matters. And there's also evidence that some of the things that have been tried to deal with here actually work quite well. Okay, let me go to the last bit. So what you're looking at here is a picture of a 1970s German motorbike. And in the mid-1970s, West Germany, as it was still called by the time, it adopted a helmet mandate. So from that day onward, everyone riding a motorbike had to wear a helmet. And later on, when criminologists were looking at the crime data, they found that in the wake of this helmet mandate, the number of motorcycle thefts dropped significantly. And at first they thought, well, we can't just conclude that this immediately means something. So they also compared, for instance, the theft of automobiles and general theft levels, because obviously it might have been something else. And when they controlled for several of these variables, they did find a significant relationship between the motor helmet mandate and the drop in motorcycle thefts. And the interesting thing here is that it shows a different view on crime control. Rather than focusing on trying to motivate people or even to support them, here it's all about whether it's easy to commit certain crimes. And stealing a motorbike becomes harder if you have to wear a helmet. Because if you're going to just steal it on the spur of the moment and you haven't brought a helmet, it's very likely that you will stand out more because you're going to be one of the few people wearing a helmet. This line of thinking has been adopted for many different types of cases. So, for instance, we see it through very basic things such as speed humps or bumps for speeding, for traffic type violations. Of course, we have all kinds of burglary protections on homes that make it harder to break in. These don't rely on law enforcement. They don't rely on social norms. They don't rely on civil obedience. They don't rely even on getting people education. They just make it harder. We see the same for cybercrime. There is we use firewalls or antivirus software. So the whole idea here is a little bit different from what we've seen before. a lot of times when we're thinking about crime control, we're thinking about why did they do it? So we're looking at the motivation, at the motives, and we're trying to sway the motives. What we're doing here is how did they do it? And we're looking at sort of the structures and the features of how crime takes place. And we're trying to find out which elements can we make harder or take out. There's several downsides here. One is it can easily lead to victim blaming. So for instance, if this analysis shows that that people who don't invest in good burglary protection become a victim of a burglary, it can easily lead to saying, okay, it's your own fault because you should have had a sort of better protection. It can also create sort of unequal results where some people are better able to protect themselves than others. The biggest downside is that during this type of interventions, which are very direct interventions, very practical interventions, it does limit freedom. Here, of course, the big debate in the US is on gun control. There is quite some strong evidence, even though in the US research about this was curbed for a number of years, showing the link between easier access to guns and certain types of violent crime. But obviously, what we've seen in the US is not only a constitutional debate about this, but also a freedom debate. Less dramatic, we've seen this with seatbelts. So in 1973, the US Congress adopted a law forbidding the National Highway Authority to mandate a ignition lock where cars couldn't start unless the seatbelts were clicked in. This would have been a really effective way to get more people to wear seatbelts, which, by the way, didn't really start to happen until the early 80s, because in the 70s there was a mandate that every car had a seatbelt, but there was no mandate to wear the seatbelt, nor was there really any enforcement or any other campaign on this. But anyway, at the time, this created such an outroar of people who said, look, it's my choice, it's my freedom. I don't want to wear a seatbelt. I don't want to be forced to wear a seatbelt. I want to have the choice. So this is sort of where we can have a debate about this. And I think the debate is interesting because often what we see is if you don't limit the choice here, you end up creating a system that forces more surveillance on people. A very good example, again, going back to cars, is distracted driving. We see that in many countries, there is more law enforcement, more surveillance, camera is used, AI is used to catch people who are driving distracted by their phones. And the funny thing is that Apple already has a patent for something that's already in your iPhones, and I'm pretty sure Samsung has something similar, where the phone knows it's in a car and it can actually switch to a safer mode. If you use Spotify in your car, you will notice that it switches to car mode. And also there's a $120 device that sort of disables the usage of a phone while you're sitting in the driver's seat. So there's very simple choices here that we're not using because we're so focused on this sort of surveillance and law enforcement approach, which of course comes with its own limiting of freedom in a more indirect way. Okay, these are the sort of big insights that I wanted to bring to the table today. Just as an overview, what the book does is sort of lead you through the different mechanisms that shape human conduct, where the law shapes us. On the one hand, on the left side, we have motivations, and I started there with extrinsic, which is punishment, but it's also tort we talk about rewards, and intrinsic, where we talk about people's own morality, social norms, and also their sense of duty. But there's also the situation people are in, whether they're able to follow the law or whether they have opportunity to break it. And there's an interaction between all these mechanisms, and to really crack the behavioral code means looking at all of these. And I wanted to end my presentation there, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Van Rooij. That was a very interesting presentation, and I was looking forward to it all week. So we'll go ahead and start. You did mention some highlights from your book, The Behavioral Code. If you could just talk a little bit more about why you and Dr. Adam Fine decided to write the book.
Yes. So we have our own stories coming to this book. So for me, I've been trained in law, have practiced as a lawyer in the 1990s. And I started to study issues like this when I moved to China in 2000 to study compliance with environmental law. And I found, I was interested in why do these rules made in Beijing don't work at the local level? And I spent a lot of time interviewing local law enforcement, managers in big factories, as well as working with farmers in other villages living next to these factories. And the more I learned, the more I saw that all my training in law hadn't prepared me for any of this. And I saw that a lot of what happened and how it worked was quite different from what I'd learned. So this moved me as I moved to the US and started to teach there and had more interactions with prosecutors, with compliance managers in firms. I increasingly started to see that what I was learning from the social and behavioral sciences was really unlike what people were doing in practice. For Adam, who came from psychology and developmental psychology, he saw, first of all, as he worked in high schools where he worked, he also worked as an intern in the Senate. He also worked teaching in prisons. And he also had a lot of interactions during his research with parole officers and with law enforcement. He increasingly came to see that all this science that he knew was not really arriving in practice. And that's sort of what we saw what we sort of saw together. There was a disconnect. On the one hand, we would be going to conferences with our colleagues who would say, everybody knows that there is no deterrence. And I would raise my hand and say, you do realize nobody knows this outside of this room. And B, if you would tell them, they would probably not accept it. I saw it also going to conferences at NYU with all these people in the Department of Justice and all these big white collar crime prosecutors and lawyers. They had no idea of how they actually got to shape compliance. But we saw that the real problem wasn't just with the sort of scientists versus the people in practice. It was also very much with the sort of broader public debate and the public opinion surrounding it. And that's why we decided to write a public book, because we see that unless we really get the average people to really see why this is a core question and what the answers are and aren't, we won't see a different politics. And the politics in this is shaping a lot of what is happening in practice.
Thank you. So in your presentation, you also mentioned, and you just touched on this a bit, that there's no conclusive evidence that stricter punishment reduces crime. And alternatively, there are many harmful potential effects of punishment. So why do you think there is this disconnect between public discourse and what research has actually demonstrated?
Yeah, so we've been really wondering about this. And I tried to find the answer, and I found, I think, 3 answers. The first is, if you look at our traditional modes of thinking, and I looked at classical thinking that we see in ancient Greek texts, the classical thinking that you find in the Old Testament, thinking that you find in ancient China and ancient India. So these are 3 unrelated classical traditions. And you find very similar writing. You find that, that humans respond to pain and pleasure, that our conduct is sort of shaped by pain and pleasure, and that for bad behavior, only pain works, and the pain has to be public so that others can see it. So somehow this idea really was there. It may have been that in these small societies, everybody, A, knew the rules, B, there was social acceptance of most of the rules. Everybody saw if somebody broke the rules, so you were the certainty of getting caught was very high, and everybody understood and saw the punishment. So it may have worked at some point, but we're in a very different situation now. Second thing we found is sort of psychological. We found there's something called moral coherence, which means that what you think is morally acceptable, you're also going to think is more effective. So a good example, they did all these studies on whether people think capital punishment is effective to deter crime. And they found people who morally accept capital punishment as a moral issue are also automatically, trying to get a sort of moral coherent view that it then also has to be effective. And we saw that, what that does, I saw it in my own sort of, looking at myself, going through all the evidence, because I've been observing myself, I saw the moral coherence at play with me. I'm not a big fan morally of capital punishment. That's not how I was raised. And I saw that any study that shows that it doesn't deter, my mind would go easy. Like, okay, yeah, I'd be clapping. Any study that said it does deter, I'm like, that can't be true. So I read it again. And when you observe yourself, and this is what we also say in the book, and where we show the reader sort of observe yourself when you're hearing the evidence, we all have moral ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. But if in the end we really want to have an effective system, we have to put them on the side for a little bit. The third answer we have is, and I can be really short on this one, is it's in our brains. We get a booster shot of happiness if we punish other people. So there's neuroscience behind this. So a lot of things are stacked against the science here, and that's why it's so important to tell this story to people, to show them, look, if you really want to be effective, you need to get over these things. You need to get past your sort of tradition, your upbringing, past your morals and past your brain, and to really look at this sort of evenly and say, okay, what really works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think that self-reflective piece is really critical. You also discussed the need for accessibility to science. Many social scientists are writing for academic audiences. What can researchers do to make science more accessible?
Yeah, so we really talk about it in the end of the book, where we talk about 3 reforms, and one of the reforms is about science. So I would say number 1, and this is rule number 1, be honest. So I think there's too much science that is either simplifying too much, I mean, showing a shortcut to something that's very complex, or generalizing too much, where they found something in one lab study and they're saying, well, this is going to change the world. So I think that's the first thing. We have to be honest. If we lose our honesty and if we lose our trust, which we have been, it's a problem. The second is take the time to sort of write for a different audience. Also put not just one study together, multiple studies together. What we really try to do in our book is not be based too much on these sort of example studies that are brought up every now and then, but rather look at bodies of work. Because a singular study is not enough to base policy on. I think those are the core things. The other thing is sort of open access publishing, which is happening more. But I think these are the core answers that I would have now.
Thank you. Procedurally fair rulemaking and enforcement are described as being critical for establishing legitimacy. This may be challenging to establish, particularly for youth who have witnessed over-policing or under-policing in their neighborhoods, and those that have had negative personal or vicarious experiences with law enforcement and agents of the law. How can the system establish legitimacy and reckon with previous injustices?
So what you're saying is true. It's a really major problem. And I know Adam's research is really focused on this. Once children develop a negative view, which they develop very young, I think the age of 5, 6, or 7 already, it's very unlikely to change. So, I mean, what I draw from that is 2 things. One is it means extra that we have for any place where there isn't a negative view yet to ensure that a negative view doesn't develop. And this is not about the view, this is about the practice. So it means to do everything to prevent any further under or over policing or abusive policing or any label that we want to put on it, a procedurally unfair policing, because any instance of this has a long-term effect in trust in the system. The second thing is, it means also we need to reform in a way that eradicates these sort of procedurally unfair practices. And there have been examples where this has been possible, but that's only step 1. And we also describe this in the book. So step 1 is getting actual reform. And this is the hardest part. I don't know anybody who knows completely how to do this, but at least it's step 1. But once you've done that, you need to do step 2 is to get back trust. And Adam, and I think he's also presented this here, he's done some experiments in LA, working with youth in communities where there has been police reform, so where there has been improvement, but he then wanted to understand, okay, how can we bring back the trust? And he saw organizing activities with police that are not about policing, but that are community activities actually work quite well. So I think this line of work to understand how you build trust once you have reformed, because otherwise it doesn't work, is a core way forward.
Thank you. So we have several questions from the audience, so I want to go ahead and honor that and move over to the audience Q&A portion. So first question, Much research has argued that when youth commit delinquent acts, this can be part of normative development and socialization. How might we incorporate that view into the framework that you have proposed today?
So when they commit good acts, right?
The question is actually when they commit delinquent acts.
Okay, so much this can be part of normative development and socialization. Yes. So I think we can incorporate that in different ways. So I think on the one hand, it shows us that in the natural development, as I also said, there's going to be a phase of deviancy, which has to do in part with brain development, in part also with bonding, with ties in your own peer group, and also getting more limited ties with your parents or with elderly. So I think for that it's important to realize that that's part of it. Understanding what it does, that it creates social norms, that it creates negative social norms where a sort of norms of a certain peer group are at play, and that these norms may be opposed to norms that may be out there in society or in the law, is a very important thing to realize, that in that sort of a setting, you may very easily trigger these negative social norms, create what psychologists call more reactance, where the group actually becomes stronger and more opposed to the law, if you're not taking them into account. So I think it's a very good remark. It's not something that's easy to do. So any community that has a sort of its own rules and its own norms, whether that is in a gang-related community or in a corporate community, is going to be much harder to change. And what I see is if law enforcement or other interventions don't take that into account, they may come to communicate or intervene in ways that actually make it worse. But there's no quick fix for this or a quick way out.
Okay, and then next, how is police legitimacy introduced to adolescents? Do you think this has unintended negative social norm messages?
Let me also, yeah, so this goes back to your question, I think. So your question is really one, if we're going to do a campaign now amongst youth who've lived a life where they just see negative experiences themselves or through others, as you said, with police, and then there's a campaign about how good the police is. I don't think that will easily work. I think it has to start, as I said, with a true reform that deals with the issues, and then you have to look at how you build back trust. But building back trust, I don't think is a campaign in of itself just to show that the police is acting better now. It has to do with much more. And it shouldn't just be about policing. At least that's what Adam's research shows.
Do you see implications in your findings and theories for compliance with frequently changing COVID rules?
Yes. So we've been studying, Adam and I, together with a whole group of scholars, compliance with COVID rules since April 2020. And we focused, first of all, at stay-at-home order compliance and social distancing. And we've been keeping at the social distancing because that's one of the rules that stayed in place in the Netherlands since the beginning. So we have longitudinal data now nearly over 1.5 years. And the consistent finding we got in studies in the US, UK, Netherlands, Israel, and China is that the most important predictor of compliance is people's capacity to follow these rules. So it's their ability to stay away from others with social distancing. So it's really about crowd control. So that's social distancing. The question was about changing rules. And we haven't studied changing rules, but from my experience and expertise, I would say each time that you change rules, you're going to lose something. You're going to get people confused, so they don't know what the rules are. Second, you're going to, by changing the rule or even the advice, I mean, look at masking. Because the authorities in the beginning said, masking is not necessary. It's actually bad because you don't know how to mask. They undermined the rule that was adopted later. They very much made it easier for others to sort of have a neutralization for themselves. Oh, it's not so bad if I don't mask, because the authorities also were very inconsistent about this. So inconsistency comes with a price of it's harder to understand the rules, it's harder to get a moral support for the rules, it's harder to have a sort of a procedurally fair operation of rules, which also includes consistency. And it also makes having a deterrent effect of punishment, which, by the way, we don't find to be associated at all with compliance, but if it would be for certain rules. So it's bad on so many levels. The problem with a pandemic is it's a moving target. So as we have new variants, as we have new information, as we have new insights, as we have vaccines, all of these variables are changing, and that means that the rules can't really stay the same. And we have politics. So politicians are under immense pressure to reduce the social and economic costs of all the rules. So they want to get rid of them each time they think they can. And that, of course, in of itself, again, if we're talking about youth, I mean, one of the most damaging things about COVID rules is what it's doing with the mental and overall health and socioeconomic circumstances of our children.
So you mentioned just now the connection to youth and some of the mental health outcomes. What do you think as far as compliance with COVID rules? Is that affecting youth in a different way than the general public?
So, I mean, our sample is not 18 minus. So for ethical reasons, we've only studied 18 plus. We clearly see that there's a correlation between age and compliance. The older, the better they comply. We see that correlation is gone if you control for fear of the disease. So it's really fear of disease that's playing out. It's not being young in of itself. We see self-control also as a good predictor. So people who are more impulsive, which most youth are, and of course, compliance with the rules comes with a higher cost for most youth. I mean, especially if you're looking at the age from, let's say, 16 to 25, 26, compared, for instance, to people over 50, because they're at their prime in their life to have social interactions which are all curbed. So I think definitely there is a link there. I think there's another interesting thing here. It may well be that with all these rules we now have, that people widely see being violated. I mean, at least I've seen this in the Netherlands. It may erode or undermine this sort of legitimacy of the system more broadly. We've seen studies that have shown if you have a rule in place that's broadly violated, and if you then put attention on that rule, it will also mean that other rules will be broken more. So there was a piece in Science about this, about the contagion effects of norms. And there's another piece on this, and we describe both of them in the book. So this is sort of a dangerous thing of the time we're living in. I think another effect we've seen of COVID, at least in the Netherlands, is that because youth have had so little opportunity to sort of express their sort of energy, their creativity, but maybe also their anger and other frustration, we've seen sort of surges in sort of nightlife brawls, in sort of hooliganism and other things. And it may well be, I haven't looked at the data or at the research, that there may be a sort of a pent-up frustration that might come out. And that might be very much in line with what criminologists have shown about strain. So the more you have strain and stress, the more likely you might engage in what is considered as deviant behavior. So I think there's many effects, and we have to wait for the longer run. And of course, there's the educational effects. So especially for people from less fortunate circumstances, they're going to be affected much more by lockdowns in education, or by sort of restricting access to education, which have all kinds of effects on their sort of development, also into potential deviant or other forms of illegal illegal conduct.
Regarding drug policy, the reason for the necessity to place certain psychoactive substances on the list of prohibited drugs is often stated to boil down to, we need to give a signal that the use of this substance is risky and unacceptable. Could you comment on the sensibility of that statement with regards to deterrence and influence on behavior?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let's, for instance, look at marijuana. So if you put marijuana, or we can even go back to alcohol. I mean, let's go to alcohol first. So the prohibition sort of did that at the constitutional level to send this signal. And of course, there was something behind that where the American Protestants wanted this rule in order to sort of curb a sort of the new influx of Catholics, as I understood it from the reading about this phase. What happens if you institute a rule that you can't enforce and that most people are not going to comply with? So if you go back to my scheme, what you see is, on the one hand, yes, you're instituting a rule and you're setting a norm. At the same time, because so many people are breaking the rule, there's this negative social norm, and actually you're undermining the legitimacy of the rule. In order to then enforce the rule, your enforcement may very well be perceived as unfair because most people are actually engaging in the behavior and people don't agree that this rule should be in place. Which then makes it harder to get a deterrent effect because so many people are breaking it. It may actually create an illegal market because there's still a demand for it, but not a supply, which may actually make it more interesting to develop it, which then can create all forms of more brutal forms of crime. So this is for the case of sort of substances where the existing societal norm, for instance, for alcohol, which is a good example, has been actually it's okay, where only politically they've made it, they have criminalized it. I think it's much more complex for substances that a larger part of society says, well, these are actually bad, like most opioids or probably crack cocaine or normal or other cocaine. I mean, depending on the substance. And there it's much more problematic because we see some of the same effects. It's still very hard to enforce it when there's still a market for it. And that's where sort of ratcheting it up with stricter enforcement may actually undermine the deterrent effect of the punishment and actually create more brutalization and have all these side effects, such as decreasing socioeconomic opportunities for those caught in this sort of system, which I think everybody's very well aware of. So what I would say, and I haven't given a full systematic answer, is you can actually use the scheme I just said to sort of go through, if you criminalize anything and you institute a punishment, what can you expect it to do? And once you do that, you can actually make a cost-benefit analysis saying, is it really worth to do it? Or are there other ways to do this?
Thank you. So we probably just have time for one more audience question that I do want to get to. So some may argue, rather than needing to ensure certainty of punishment, what we need to be doing is finding ways of instituting supports for youth to limit or reduce their offending patterns. What do you think about this?
Oh, I 100% agree. So the sort of recommendations we have in the end of the book, we go through a set of 6 questions you have to ask. And punishment is the last one. I only started with punishment because I don't see any system completely without punishment. But if you're going to punish, you have to focus more on the certainty than on the severity. That's all I was saying. But long before you want to do that, if you want to prevent things, you don't have to get to punishment. So I think the support and the evidence for this is really, really strong. And the evidence for punishment working is not that strong. So I fully agree with this. The problem is selling this in a political arena. I think that's where really we all have a task to play in terms of how do you get the science, and I've tried my best to show the science. How do you build it in a story that's appealing to people who also feel unsafe because of crime? And that is, of course, a concern people may have, for which they automatically then turn to punishment. And you want to show them a different story. I think that's where my core challenge is, how to get to those people.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Van Rooij. I'd really like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for taking the time to share this incredibly interesting and meaningful work with us. We're genuinely grateful to have had you join us today. Before I move on to closing announcements, are there any last thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, I really want to thank you for this opportunity. For me, it's really important to be engaged with your audience. I think you're doing fabulous work. And I think the sort of application of these things to the youth justice system is really, really vital. So I hope we can continue to exchange. Anybody wants to contact me, my email, you can easily Google it online. You can also put it in the chat. And thank you so much. I will put it in the chat myself.
Great, thank you. So before we close, I do have a few announcements and items that I'd like to put on everybody's radar. The next session of our Lunch and Learn series will be on January 24th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be hosting Dr. Samantha Busa, the Clinical Director of Gender and Sexuality Service and Clinical Associate Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Child Study Center at NYU. Dr. Busa will be discussing risk and resilience factors for transgender youth, how to provide an affirming environment, and how to promote dignity and respect for transgender individuals. The registration link for this webinar series will be posted in the chat momentarily. Immediately following this webinar, you'll also be receiving a survey via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey as it allows you to provide further feedback for us. It should take no longer than 5 minutes. And we will also be putting the link for this survey in the chat shortly. Finally, if you've not already done so, please feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. Just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I'd like to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about Dr. Van Rooij and his work that he's presented today. We look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.